Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this Ius Laboris webinar. My name is Annie and I will be facilitating the session for you today. So the presentation will be given by a set of panelists today, all from different member firms of Ius Laboris. Okay, that's all from me. I'm now turning over to Jose to start the session.
Well, thank you, Annie. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see so many of you here today. What we have today is a program that was mostly designed after an article that came out, or written material that came out and draw much attention from clients and audience. Basically, what we have is a situation where we have to deal with the COVID-19 impacting the world in a great way. But now it is not the only factor now changing the world of work. In this webinar, we will be seeing from the perspectives of Belgium, Canada, Brazil, and the UK, the growing phenomenon of atypical work, including gig economy and how these might pan out in the future. The firms participating to this webinar are Claeys Engels from Belgium, Mathews Dinsdale from Canada, Veirano from Brazil, Lewis Silkin from the UK. With this brief introduction, and I'm very much conscious of time, I'll pass the word to David, who will introduce or run us through the first item of our webinar today, which is the gig economy. David, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Jose, and hello to everybody who's joined us today. We can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about the gig economy today. I think it's first important to start with recognizing that there is no universal definition of the gig economy. What one person might think of as falling within the gig economy, some businesses would say, well, actually, no, we're not part of that. Equally, employees may not see themselves as part of the gig economy, but the work they're doing is increasingly being seen as if it is, and potentially also therefore regulated in an employment law context in the same way as if they were part of what people would often most associate with the gig economy, companies such as Uber, which I'll come on to in a moment. But there are a few factors that I think are common to how most people would see the gig economy. At the heart of that, I think, is flexibility. This is something that is increasingly controversial, but it's something that is often enjoyed by both the business side of the relationship and also the individual side of the relationship. For businesses, it gives them new ways to work, to manage how they use labour, and equally for employees or for the worker side of the relationship, there's often this ability to work when they want, how they want. But there's often a tension as to exactly how much flexibility they do enjoy in practice. Second, I think it's also important to bear in mind that technology has really underpinned a lot of the gig economy over recent years. In some ways, that's particularly the algorithms that allocate work through apps, and the rise of platform work has been particularly marked in recent years. But equally, it's important to bear in mind that the actual work that's being performed is often not something radically different. For example, driving a taxi is clearly something that's existed long before the rise of the gig economy. In terms of the link with the coronavirus pandemic, I think it's important to bear in mind that the rise predates the coronavirus pandemic, and we can see that Uber was founded back in 2009 and went through its IPO before the pandemic hit the world. Equally though, coronavirus has definitely accelerated new ways of working. You only have to think about how many restaurants, for example, have been shut over the course of the last year in countries around the world. And people will now be getting food from those restaurants in new ways, often through delivery drivers, often through platform-based apps. And so there's been a huge rise in the gig economy. And it's been interesting to see a company such as Deliveroo has actually gone through an IPO during the pandemic itself, after a year in which its operations have significantly increased because of that disruption to traditional ways of working and living. There's been a huge rise in litigation, though, that has gone with this rise in the gig economy. From the UK perspective alone, we've had the Uber case, began back in 2015 and is now being decided by the Supreme Court just earlier this year. And likewise, companies like Deliveroo have also faced claims over numerous years, with cases still ongoing before the Court of Appeal. So this is definitely an area where we're seeing changes all the time in terms of how the courts are approaching these new challenges that have been thrown up by the gig economy itself. I think it's also important to bear in mind this isn't something that's unique to any particular country. There have been challenges on every continent of the world except Antarctica, and if anyone knows of any challenges in Antarctica, please do let me know. But But I think the fact that this is something that is affecting people in almost every country of the world, and at least on every continent, shows that there are going to be challenges that are common across different countries. But equally, as everyone will know, employment law is something that is often very country specific. That said, we also are seeing some pan-European efforts, at least. The European Commission has recently engaged in the first stage of its consultation with its social partners on platform work. And this is very much putting the burden on the social partners to look at the issues that are being thrown up by the gig economy and how it is transforming the world of work, and to say to them, what do you think we need to be doing at this stage? And that reflects the European Commission's particular desire to have the partners work together rather than legislating in the first instance. So there's clearly an element of, if people can work out arrangements that work, then they will be allowed to do so. But this threat of litigation is clearly underpinning how the gig economy is developing. And just finally, that can also be seen over in California, where we've had the Proposition 22 ballot initiative relatively recently. That was approved last autumn, but is already now being challenged. And for those of you who aren't aware, the Proposition 22 was to do with how people working in the transport and delivery sector in California would be treated, whether they were employees or whether they were actually independent contractors. But interestingly, there's almost a hybrid part to that, with people getting certain benefits, even if they are independent contractors. And that leads us neatly now into the questions that we've got that I'd like to ask the rest of the panel to start to engage in now. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I think the first issue that is something that is important across countries is what factors determine if people working in the gig economy are employees. So perhaps if I could hand over to Chris from Belgium on this one.
Well, David, I think my answer is, of course, going to disappoint everybody, because I'm going to give you a real lawyer answer saying that there is no straight answer that holds for all of the countries. There's no straight answer for all of purposes, meaning labor law may have a different definition of what an employee is compared to social security law, compared to tax law. And I think there's no overall answer either with respect to the different platforms, because they all operate a bit differently, control people differently, have different schedules in time. So there's no all over answer. And we need to look at all of the circumstances of the facts concerned. And of course, I think what's also important is, and I'm referring to the second question, I'm not answering it. What is important is whether or not in a given national system, you have a distinction, a binary distinction between self-employed on the one hand and employee on the other hand, or whether you have three categories, where you have self-employed on the one hand, the true self-employed, the undertaker that promotes itself, him or herself on the market as a real self-employed. You have the worker who is not so self-employed, but is not a subordinate employee at the same time. So if you have this distinction in three categories instead of two, of course, you're going to look at the facts differently and look at different criteria. But what I see, and it's very interesting, I'll show you on the camera, it's a new report that came out from the ILO. It's ILO working paper number 27 of March of this year, platform work and the employment relationship, where the ILO and a couple of professors, one of them is a colleague of mine here in Leuven, look at what the case law is dealing with platform work and what the criteria should be. And what it comes down to is that they often refer to what you find back in an old ILO recommendation on the nature of the employment relationship, recommendation number 198. And if you need a reference to it, just send me an email. I'll drop the reference for you, dating back in 2006, where basically the ILO, the recommendation, is referring to hybrid tests, multi-factor tests, looking at, of course, at instructions and at control, as they are mentioned here, looking at who provides the tools to do the work, looking at whether or not you have to personally perform the services, whether you pay, how you're paid, whether it's regular pay, etc. All of these things are taken into account, and the ILO recommendation gives a nice overview of all of these things that you could look at. But what's most important, I think, and it refers to the last bullet of your first question, is that in most of the countries, and it's also reported in that March 2021 report, in most of the countries, facts rule over the contract that the people have concluded with the platform. And I think it struck me when I was reading the UK case, but David can better comment on it than I do, is that the court even said in that case that the contracts were too difficult for the drivers to understand, and basically that most likely none of them had even read their contract when they signed it. I thought it was a very peculiar consideration for a court to take into account. But I think we need to look at all the facts of all of the different platforms, look at them in their context, and then apply some kind of a hybrid test where facts prevail over the contract, unless, of course, the law explicitly determines that a given sort of worker, a given platform worker, is to be considered as a self-employed or as a subordinate employee. Of course, then the law takes precedence over anything else with an irrefutable presumption. David, to you.
I'll just come back in there actually, because the point about the UK is quite an interesting one, and I'll hand over to Greg and Jose in a second as well. But the decision that Chris is referring to there is the Uber decision from the UK Supreme Court very recently. And one of the things it looked at there was the fact that, as Chris has alluded to, the drivers, the Uber drivers, were very tightly controlled by Uber, and Uber could exercise a huge amount of power over how the drivers could work, when they could work. For example, it would log them out of the app as effectively a punishment if they didn't comply with certain requirements. So as Chris has said, it's a multi-factor test, but on the facts in that case, the court did look at them and said that there was a huge amount of control. So I think control is absolutely one of the key ones. In addition, they also looked at the fact that the Uber drivers had their remuneration set by Uber. So if these people were genuinely self-employed, but they were unable to set their own levels of pay, then that was clearly problematic as the court saw it. But as Chris also alluded to, the court essentially said that you can't just start with the contract, precisely because you have this inequality in bargaining power. But inequality of bargaining power is something we'll see all around the world. So it'd be interesting to see how the countries have also dealt with this. So perhaps, Greg, if you wanted to give an indication of how the approach is in Canada on these kind of issues.
So we have the same kind of Manichaean employee versus independent contractor division in many areas of the law, but we also have this third category, which is known as dependent contractor. And so delivery drivers here are able to unionize, not because the tribunals declare them to be employees, but because they're declared to be dependent contractors, which is an easier find. You don't have to, the bar is a lot lower. And our common law rules relating to rights on termination and so forth extend to dependent contractors as well. So these are not new concepts here. These are concepts that were developed in other contexts, but they're now being applied to gig workers. And so, if I had to make everyone has to operate within the context that they find themselves in, and some countries have this more rigid division between employee and independent contractor than we do here. But I think, if I had to make a prediction, that a lot of places will start to do what we're doing here, which is have essentially a third category, where you get some rights from one category, some from the other category, and you can retain some of the flexibility, but you get some minimum floor, and so that's what I think will, it's kind of a messy situation here, but that's what I predict we'll see, because I think frankly a lot of the gig workers like the gig work. There's people who certainly get on the bandwagon of saying, oh, well, they're being exploited, but a lot of them like it, and it does provide additional opportunities for people to earn income, and many of the opponents have skin in the game on the opposite side. So it's the postal workers union that wants to unionize all the delivery workers. Surprise, surprise. and the food workers union that wants to unionize delivery workers. So, you know, one has to approach some of these questions a little skeptically. Anyway, so we promote the third way here. That's in summary.
And what about yourself, Jose, in Brazil? How the Brazilian courts approaching this and the legal framework there?
Oh, it's not entirely different. Although Brazil is, as compared to other countries, perhaps more litigious venue, I think that gig economy workers really brought litigation to a whole different level. We have never seen so many cases of misclassification as we have now. In the past, they primarily dealt with agents or executives who were engaged for the sake of more favorable tax regimen under an independent services agreement. But now, drivers and riders in general, for hail rides or for delivery services, are loading courts with their claims. And courts are still divided. We have employment as a matter of statute in Brazil. So it's not the choice of contract. It's not the word of the contract that will determine if someone is an employee or a contractor, but how facts fit into the legal description, the legal definition of an employee. And the word in Portuguese for that, or that would capture the most important element of employment, is subordination, which is a blend of supervision with disciplinary capacity or capacity to take disciplinary actions, whether directly or indirectly, including controls, including the control of means of production, including the controls of how fares are determined. On the other hand, all such drivers or riders own their professional tool. They're either they own or they lease their cars or their bikes. And courts have been divided between those two situations. But I think that there is a growing concern from a social security standpoint. As independent contractors, they would need to pay their social security dues or taxes. But they don't. In fact, they are making ends meet and they cannot afford to pay for that. So there's a growing concern whether or not courts should look at them as employees simply because they have virtually no protection from Social Security, whether in terms of retirement, whether in terms of pension for sick leaves or for accidents or work-related accidents. So there we may be seeing in the future, but that's for a later moment, some new stuff in terms of legislation. But for the time being, it is still very controversial whether they are employees or not.
I think there's some really interesting points there, in particular about the wider social implications. You mentioned tax there, Jose, and that clearly is something that's going to matter. You know, if you think, you know, from the UK perspective at least, the concept of the nature of the relationship is really important. You know, does an employer need to make social security contributions in respect to them? What rate does the individual need to be contributing? But also, if people are operating as separate businesses, actually, do they fall within our VAT rules, so the services tax rules? And if you think about it, you know, at least in here in the UK, and I'm sure around the world, we've got all kinds of issues of the cost of the coronavirus pandemic. So I think that the fiscal side of things is going to be really interesting. In addition, though, coronavirus has obviously caused some challenges in terms of the implications of these rights. You know, one of the points here on the slide is the health and safety rights. And here in the UK, we've seen developments of how the government has to provide these health and safety rights for workers, which are these people in the UK that fit into that intermediate category. So perhaps, Chris, if there have been any developments sort of particularly triggered by the coronavirus pandemic over the last year in the gig economy context. I think, Chris, you're on mute.
I think that with COVID-19, it was very interesting to see that a lot of governments stepped in and provided some kind of support where you normally would be looking at employees only to get unemployment benefits, etc. You see that a lot of the governments stepped in and also provided some benefits to self-employed workers, which raised the question for me, why do we still make the difference? And if you read the ILO papers on decent work, they say, well, what we try to do is to find some decent protection, basically for any kind of worker, whether he's self-employed or not. So I would think that what Corona has brought in is an opportunity to rethink the whole system, and to think about providing a basic fundamental protection for everybody, without at the same time losing the flexibility, etc., which comes along with working as a self-employed normally. I think most of our labor law protection comes with a very high degree, especially in continental Europe, with a high degree of inflexibility. And referring to what Greg was saying, that a lot of the gig workers like the work that they do, like the flexibility that they have. If you turn them into employees, then basically a lot of the flexibility that they want themselves is going to get lost. And I think one of the points that we might discuss later on is also issues on, I see here, on working time. How are you going to control working time? As an employer, you're obliged to control the working time of your workers. How are you going to do this when somebody can decide just when they want to work and for how long they want to work? So I really think that with the gig economy, there are all kinds of new questions that should make us rethink fundamentally our whole system of labor law and the protections that come along with it. But unfortunately, I think with most of our politicians thinking that the long-term vision extends over a period of 1 month, I don't think it's really going to happen fast, but at least at the European level, the Commission is launching some consultation process. Whether it will lead to results and how fast it will go, that's something else. But at least I think we're starting to think of providing some kind of protection above basic protection in the area of health and safety, where I think we have moved a bit away from the big distinction between an employee and a self-employed. Discrimination legislation is about the same, where you apply it both to self-employed and to subordinate employees. But I think this is the time to rethink our whole system, but unfortunately, at the same time, I think we're not going to. And we are meddling on the way we have before, because to be fairly honest, when Jose was referring to subordination, I wrote a PhD at the end of the 80s on the relationship of subordination, a 600-page document that basically is still the same discussion that we are having nowadays. Nothing has changed. We have been complaining about the system for the last 50 years and nothing changes. So we do need initiatives like the Commission initiative that you referred to, David.
Chris, you're going to circulate your PhD thesis for the attendees?
It's not online.
Oh.
It dates back from ancient times.
It's interesting what you say there, Chris, about the working time point, because this is something that, whilst on the one hand in the UK we now have our Supreme Court decision in Uber, which gives great guidance in terms of whether someone is a worker, so in this intermediate category as it is in the UK. But what it did actually also do at the end was basically say we can't yet come up with a clear answer on what counts as working time. So it found that back in 2016 there were certain rules that govern working time. But one of the things that has happened since 2016 is this huge rise of people having multiple apps open simultaneously, making themselves available to say five separate platforms. Now, the question is, if you log into 5 separate platforms, do you get 5 times the minimum wage, even when you're not actually on a delivery for any of those companies at any particular time? And potentially, if you can also reject those deliveries. So, Greg, over in Canada, how have the Canadian courts and the legal framework sort of addressed this issue, or is it still an issue to be addressed?
So, in Canada, we have a skill of ignoring problems as long as possible to let somebody else figure them out first. And I would say that's how it's happening here, because for precisely the reasons you're describing. I mean, they're putting aside the question of whether somebody's an employee or they're a dependent contractor or independent contractor. There's the question of, well, when is somebody performing work? And what arises from that finding, because, for example, there's minimum wage issues, there's workers' compensation issues, there's health and safety liability issues. So for who is your employer, or who is responsible, the contracting party, at the time that whatever happens, and we really don't have an answer for this yet. And I think, personally, again, I just speaking for myself, I don't think you can shove gig workers into the same A versus B category as historically we've had for employees and independent contractors, because you can switch between apps, or as you point out, have them open simultaneously, which is something that really never happened in any major scale before. So it's we're grappling with it, sort of. I mean, the truth is, we're letting things here. We're largely letting things happen as they happen, and there's not a lot of pressure apart from some of the union sector and some the media to start having rules around these issues. But that'll change. I mean, there will be trends out of the US and UK and Europe and so forth that people will start to take a look at here. But right now, there's no answer to that. So for those who are looking for, what is the minimum wage for somebody, an Uber driver or a delivery driver? Don't know. It's the answer. I mean, if they're an employee, we know what the rate is, but we don't know how many hours they've worked. So again, going back to Chris's early unsatisfactory answer, it depends, and we don't know. So there.
And Jose, what about in Brazil, and in particular, one issue that might be interesting is the pressure, where there is a stimulus for things to change, the union movements in particular. Are you seeing sort of issues with organised labour, sort of trying to get involved in this issue to try and shape the future, and put that pressure on governments to sort of lead to changes in the future?
Yeah. I think we have a very peculiar situation in Brazil. We have at the bottom of the problem, or on the very basis of the problem, a population of workers that is really divided. When we leave the legal debate and go for social media and see ordinary people making not legal comments about the benefits of having a formal employment or a informal arrangement within the gig economy, we will see that people are divided. There are people that praise their liberty, their capacity to make their own income, and that most of the costs that the employer or the contracting company will turn into wages, not into benefits that come through the government, especially because we have in Brazil this unique severance arrangement under which the government has the legal custody or temporary custody of severance fees. So employees would rather say that in fact they prefer to get paid maximum or maximize their revenues. I'm sorry. The question is that unions in Brazil have an important role. They have this compulsory authority. They represent every worker within every region. So they are somehow organized, and they are, I think, pushing the line towards employment. So I see that there may be in the Congress, not really now, but in the near future, perhaps 1-2 years from now, a new piece of law. And my anticipation is that there will be an intermediary category closer to an independent contractor, providing for minimum social rights, minimum wage, perhaps, most definitely mandatory payments to social contribution by the company, perhaps a share that will be deducted from wages, from the payments to workers, compulsory contribution by workers as well. But I don't see them, or I don't anticipate that they will have as many statutory benefits as employees have today. So in this binary arrangement that we have, they might be seen as a special category of independent contractors only, with some degree of protection. As to COVID times, the government is using unemployment funds, or they used unemployment funds last year to pay a small allowance, a small aid to workers in general who are below a certain wage level. They will probably doing this this year again. But at the end, it's determined on a wage basis, not on individuals' status. So I think that legislation is coming through, but not in any way affected by the current situation we have. This is a long due issue that will be accelerated by gig economy companies.
So I think with that, so the look to the future of watch this space, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this topic in due course. I'm conscious of moving on because we've got another half to this webinar today. But just quickly, there is a question and answer option for people to put forward issues. And we've got one question in particular, which I'm just going to touch on very quickly, which was about whether certain kinds of arrangements would cause legal and compliance issues from an employment law perspective. And I think, having a read of this question, there's a reference to the desire essentially to supervise those activities. I think, from what everyone has said today, everything will always be a very fact-specific answer, unfortunately, in this area. But I think supervision is something that from all countries is a potential issue in terms of employment status, if that's what the business wants to avoid. So that's something to bear in mind on that. Otherwise, I'll hand over now as we move on to the second half of the section.
All right, thank you very much. So we're going to talk about remote working, and Annie, if you could move on to the next slide, thank you. So the remote work is, as with many things, I mean, here we're doing a Zoom webinar. These are actually not new technologies, really. Remote working has been possible for at least a decade. Video calls have been possible for longer than that. Many of the techniques and practices that we were all forced to adopt about a year ago have been available for a long time, thankfully. So it was an easy transition, pretty quick transition for most of us to go to remote work. And so the question is, now that we're a year in and we're at some level looking at the end or gradual diminution of the pandemic, what's going to happen? So it's one thing to have somebody who work remote for 3 weeks, but it's now been a year or more, and we're going to see that many employees who've had the opportunity to work from home don't want to go back to the office for a variety of reasons. Some of them, I mean, I'll tell you, one of our favorite pastimes in Canada is that we get VPNs so that we can pretend that we're somewhere else for purpose of getting better Netflix and other shows that aren't licensed by this, what we call the CRTC. So actually, by the way, Sweden is the best place to be if you want the best Netflix, just saying for the benefit of the audience. But we have employees who are doing the same thing. They're getting VPN connections so that they appear to be where they were, but in fact, they've moved. So they've left. Canada's a big country. I mean, it's as big geographically as the United States, it's as big as China. It's bigger than Europe. People can leave and not tell anyone. They can go back home, whatever that means, and they don't tell the employer. And so when the employer says, "Well, I want you to come in for a meeting," they will play this game, saying, "Oh, well, I've got an appointment or whatever." But in fact, they're thousands of miles away. We had a judge who is in the Superior Court who's believed to have relocated to Bermuda to conduct court business from his house in Bermuda. That was never confirmed, but that's believed to have occurred. And so on the one hand, you're going to have, you currently have, and I think you're going to have people who don't want to come back. or at least if they come back, they're going to come back on their terms. That's what they will want. And employers will have to deal with that. So one of the questions we'll deal with this is, what can you require as an employer? And then on the other hand, you've got employers who've discovered, wow, I had a lot of office space for people. I don't really need it. I want them to stay home. They can work from home. I don't want them coming into the office anymore. I'm going to shrink my space. And you may have distinctions between groups. So you have one group that the employer wants to come in, and the other group they say, you're not that important. You stay home. If you have employees who want to come back and employers who don't want them back, what does that mean? And then you have more practical issues, which I think we brushed over when the pandemic hit, which is these remote workers. Where are they? Who are they living with? What's their home situation? Who do they share an internet line with? Who do they share the device with? I mean, I think we all saw that lawyer who became a kitten on YouTube, and our speculation is that he was sharing his computer with a grandchild who put the Instagram filter on as a kitten, because I doubt very much he was doing that. Maybe he was, but you have people sharing devices, and so what do you do about that if you're going to have remote working going forward? Then you have questions about employers who are hiring people who are primarily remote. Well, here, and I'm sure in Europe, but certainly in the US as well, laws about the worker protections or hours or overtime or termination rights or what have you often depend upon the particular jurisdiction where you live. And when you hire somebody remotely, you have to be conscious of where they are, because at least here, and I think in most places, it's the location where the work is performed that's going to govern which laws apply. And the fact that you can do it over Zoom or through a server somewhere else, or even through a VPN connection, isn't going to change the physical location issue. And the other issue is, what about employees who want to move from point A to point B? If they're a remote worker, does that change the law that governs their employment? And do you have a right to say something about that as the employer? Can you make continued employment contingent on, well, you have to remain in the state of Texas, or you have to remain in the province of Ontario, or you have to remain in the UK, or you have to be in certain province in Brazil, because the laws differ, and it differs sometimes in very important ways. I'll take an example in Canada. We have in Quebec, technically, all business communication with employees is to be in the French language. So if you have an employee who moves from Ontario to Quebec, do you all of a sudden have to communicate with them in French if they demand it? Well, maybe. So that's an issue that's going to have to get worked through. And then we have the issue of hiring foreign workers, which is done without a lot of thought, typically, and because they're good, they're often less expensive, and you can get around a lot of the immigration issues by doing a remote working arrangement. I mean, it's not easy to get a work visa to work in Canada. I mean, it's easier than the States, but it's not easy. So that's a potential solution, but then you run into the problem of compliance with foreign law rules, and you may not have and there could be tax issues, there could be all kinds of issues around hiring foreign workers that people don't think of. And can you have arbitration clauses with governing law provisions? In here, for example, Uber had an arbitration clause in its relationship with its drivers that required arbitrations to take place in Amsterdam under certain commercial rules. I can't recall the details exactly, but our court struck that down because they said there's no individual gig worker who's possibly ever going to attend an arbitration hearing in Amsterdam to deal with a contract dispute with Uber. It will not happen. So they said that's an unconscionable contract, and that they struck it out. But what do you do about disputes if you're hiring people in other jurisdictions? What laws apply? What's the forum? Can you have ways of private ways of dealing with that aren't the courts? Most employers, I'll just say, they don't, when they're hiring somebody in foreign jurisdiction X, they don't hire lawyers to sort that problem out. We're dealing with this, I'll just tell you, in our practice, because we deal with US issues all the time in Canada. This is now a rampant problem of people working in the States or working in Canada, but being in the States. It's great for us as lawyers because we're getting problems we've never had to answer questions about before. So thank you, remote work. Thank you, COVID. But that's in the way of introduction. So remote work is a great innovation that was responsive to the pandemic, but I think it's raised a lot of issues. And I'm going to turn, if we could go to the next slide, Annie. I'm going to turn the questions over. I think the first person is Jose.
Thank you, Greg. Well, in terms of the first question, I'm glad I'm getting at least an easy one. Remote work has been regulated by change of our labor code before COVID times. So at least I have a straightforward answer to provide. The rule of thumb is that remote work needs consent of the employee, but the company has the discretionary capacity to call the employee back to presential work or on-site work at any time without needing the employee's consent. There are, of course, some issues that need attention, particularly in terms of work safety, but the consent is the key. The employee has the capacity to say that I don't have the means, I don't have the will, I don't have the structure to work from home, which in COVID times actually poses a challenge because for a small period of time during the first year of pandemics, we might be seeing that again. There was a temporary change in the law, which enabled employers to switch employees to remote work by an unilateral decision, by their decision only. And that has brought several issues for those who actually didn't have the structure or the capacity to work from home. I'm afraid that we might be seeing this again this year, but somehow I think that companies are accommodating and finding ways to work around this incapacity, especially because the law has also a clause that requires the employer to provide all the costs and tools and structure for workers. So there are employers now who are leasing and are leasing desks, are leasing chairs, they're leasing work equipment to support their workers from home. But after the pandemic is gone, we will be back to normal, and this will be a situation whereby I would say that consent will remain or will be the key to be on home office or working remotely.
So what about in the situation in the UK, David?
So I think that final comment from Jose about consent is really important because a year into the pandemic now, people are working at home. I'm doing it myself right now as we speak. But businesses are now having to think about the future. How are they going to structure their workforce? Where is their workforce going to be based? And so we're seeing huge numbers of requests now for people to have that flexibility. But I think the key there is it's a request for it. So it's not actually a right to demand that they can work remotely. Now, lots of contracts will already have some kind of mobility clauses in, but that's often because the business would think we need the employee to work away from their usual place of work, business travel, international travel, and so on. But what businesses are now having to put in place is policies that are going to govern this for the future. And in some ways, there's almost an analogy here, and I hate to use the word Brexit, but in the same way as many things had never been set up with something like Brexit in mind, I think the employment contracts now and employment policies are now being set up with this in mind, because it's not simply the issue of, can an employee, physically do their job from home, but the wider range of issues that are going to crop up for employers. And I suspect this is the same around the world. How do health and safety obligations apply in the home workplace, for example? It's practical things like that, which many employers want to be very accommodating and want to be flexible where that's possible. And Greg, you even touched on the potential cost savings from not paying rent for having huge office space, as people would previously have done. But ultimately, can things actually operate properly if people are out of the office? And again, just another example on the health and safety. If you think about financial services, often you'll have people working in very regulated environments where you've got to have certain levels of supervision and control for regulatory purposes. And so there are all kinds of questions that come up there. So businesses will almost always need to have that flexibility to change things if their own regulatory obligations change. And that's before we even look at people moving overseas. That's even just in a domestic context.
And Chris, what about Belgium and the EU more generally?
I think that the word consent is, of course, a very important word in this context. And for us, teleworking, home working requires consent of the employee. But we do have a number of clients, and some of them we have in common with David, who are thinking about having only workspaces in the future for 10% of their total workforce. And these are companies with more than 100,000 employees. So they are thinking about the 10% that could keep a job with an office ready for them when they want to come to work. And all the rest will have to consent to working from home. And if they don't consent, they're probably going to lose their job. So the word consent is important, but I think it's also at the same time very relative. I think also that in the future, we're going to see a lot of people requesting some kind of telework. I think people are fed up. We all are, because we're all working from home. I think now we're all fed up and want to go back to the office. But I think maybe different from what's the situation in Brazil. I think in Belgium, things will never be the same again. I think telework, homework is going to be there. And while we in our own law firm used to refuse it to assistants, not to the lawyers, but to assistants, basically when COVID came in from day 0 to day 1, we completely switched to telework. They enjoy it and they will certainly ask for it, I think, after the pandemic is gone, whenever that may be. And they will be, I think, aided by the government, because we introduced basically a new concept. Consent is not an issue now because the government obliges us as an employer to make as many people work at home or telework as possible. And we introduced the concept of a teleworkable job. And now as an employer, since a week or two, you have to determine which job in your company is not teleworkable. And all the other jobs are teleworkable, and all these other people are supposed to work from home and do not show up in the office, but for very occasionally. So these people who all have a teleworkable job now, I think will definitely in the future, when things get back to normal, will definitely come up and ask us to continue with some kind of telework, not full-time, but with some kind of telework. And I think it will be extremely hard as an employer to refuse people to give people the permit, or to refuse people the permission to work from home. I think it will be a topic for future negotiations, the same as the health and safety issues, because we all take it for granted that all of our people can just work from home, but they don't all have the same space that we have. They don't all have a special desk, etc., special chair. And to be honest, I've had people, I know people where both the couples have to work from home. They're working at the same living room table with 2 kids running around when the schools are closed, etc. Things like that, of course, need to be discussed, and the health and safety issue here, I think, will be a big one for the future.
So that brings us to the second question, and maybe David, you can kick this one off. What can an employer demand to know about where an employee lives, what their arrangements are?
So I think the best way to think about this is an employer is going to be under certain obligations as an employer. So I've already touched on, for example, health and safety or financial services. So there are some areas where an employer is simply going to have to say, we need to know certain information. But I think it's really important also to bear in mind that ordinarily when people are working in the office, you wouldn't expect your employer to say, who are you living with, for example. Now, clearly there are some occasions where issues could crop up and people might declare it. So for example, if you have lawyers working on the different side of a case from each other, at home, there may be conflict issues in that kind of situation. You would expect people to be declaring things, or for example, relationships in the office. But there's always been a big barrier in terms of personal data and personal privacy. And I don't think that coronavirus necessarily changes that. And you can see that the issue of vaccine passports, for example, shows how sensitive people are to having their employer knowing everything about their own personal life. So at least in the UK, I think how things are primarily operating is the employers saying we need to know certain information for particular reasons. So, are you in the UK still is clearly going to be relevant for them to comply with their tax obligations and their social security contribution obligations. Equally, health and safety, have you got the right setups is important because the employer is under that legal duty. But I think that the employer demanding to know the ins and outs of somebody's personal life, I think they need to be able to show that nexus to the employment relationship in order to be able to do that. And ultimately, I think if the employer can demonstrate why the information is absolutely necessary, then it's reasonable for the employer to be requesting that. But I wouldn't see this as a carte blanche for employers simply to know everything about how an employee is operating. And one of the issues that particularly jumps out there is you've had situations of people being monitored remotely throughout the day, almost expected to be on a live webinar throughout the day to make sure the employer can see what they're doing. And you can already see backlashes against companies that have been doing that. So I think companies need to be very careful, and it's going to be much better putting in a targeted request for information that they can demonstrate that they need, rather than seeing this as an open opportunity to just gather more data on people.
And Jose, what about in Brazil?
Well, I think that privacy is a challenge. There is some degree of information that an employer may ask, and all of them relate to work conditions and work safety. The law requires the company to provide workers or employees with instructions and orders in terms of work safety, mostly about ergonomics. And of course, they must ask employees if they already have the equipment or the desk, the chair that are suitable to those ergonomics rules. Now, the question about who they live with, this is something that goes beyond the employer's capacity or interest. There may be situations whereby an employee will bring to the table or will bring to discussion home accommodations with who they live with, perhaps to explain why they would prefer to be on site for better concentration. But this is not something that companies should take the initiative of asking. They must focus on all information that it's only essential to comply with work safety regulations.
What about, like, just as a question for the group, what about the issue of you need to have a room where you can close the door, for example, in order to be allowed to work at home, so that there's privacy for the employer's information or clients that you're talking to or what have you, that others can't listen in or record the activity that you're doing while you're at home.
Greg, I really think it's something that we really need to think about for the future, because I think the request might be completely justified. If we really think about ourselves and what kind of requirements that all of our clients impose on us to comply with GDPR requirements, privacy of their data, security of their data, etc. If you then transport that to the living room of somebody, where you're living together with somebody else with access to your screen, etc., who can see what you're doing for a client, I think there are some serious issues there. I don't have a ready-made solution for it, but I do think that an employer can justifiably ask the questions. The more difficult thing for me is, what if the employee doesn't provide the answer? If the employee refuses to answer, are you really going to be able to sanction the employee? And I seem to remember a case from 20 years ago where when Dutch football, and I hope there are no Dutch people listening now, was still important in the world, and Ajax and Veirano were two great soccer teams, where there was a couple of people who had an affair basically, and one was in the board of directors of Ajax, the other one of Veirano, the two big rivals, and one of them got fired. And I think the courts there said, listen, this is none of your business what they do in the bedroom. And as an employer, I think I would rightfully ask the question also, but I have issues around what to do and how to sanction if the employee doesn't provide the answer. I think that a lot of this belongs to the privacy of the individual, the request for separate rooms where you can work so that nobody can see your screen, etc., seems more justified than to try to get into your private life of the different employees. And then as far as can you require somebody to live somewhere? It's very funny, we got these questions, I think, quite a lot 20 years ago. Can you have some residency requirements, etc.? But they seem to be popping up again now, and maybe it's because people are working more remotely, etc. But can you ask an employee not to move countries? And I think it's a valid request. David made a reference to it, that it has importance in tax issues, it has importance in social security issues, and move from one country to the other can make it double expensive for an employer. So can you request the employee? I think you can validly request, but there again, can you force an employee not to move countries? I'm not so sure. I think the European Convention on Human Rights may give you an opportunity as an employee to choose where you live. Is that a valid reason for an immediate termination of the employment contract? Big question mark, I think.
And it may provide opportunities for some jurisdictions to be competitive for remote working by saying, look, we will, if you're an employee of X, you're an employee of X company in X jurisdiction, we will apply the laws that you and the employer agree to apply, as long as it's either the laws of this place or it's the laws of the place where the employer is located. Because that would provide a little certainty, at least for the employer. I think we've reached time now, and so I appreciate that there were some questions that folks wanted to have answered, and I'm sorry we haven't had an opportunity to get to them. But I know that Annie wanted to wrap up for us and give some more information about some new resources on the Ius Laboris site.
Yes, thank you, Greg. So unfortunately, we didn't have the time to take all the questions, but I suggest that the panelists can get back to those people by email. I will provide them a Q&A report, so it will be done that way. So for more information about today's topic, I advise that you check out our new series page on informal and atypical work patterns on our website, where we have several interesting resources available. And then for more information about our webinars and podcasts that we do quite often, you can visit the links that I've provided you here. And so on our website, you can find all the past recordings, for example, in the upcoming webinars, and download the slide decks for each one. So finally, I would also like to thank everyone for attending, and thanks also to our panelists for their insights today. So with that, this webinar will now be ending. Thank you all.